Hello, and welcome back to Beyond the Breakers for part 2 of our series on the Spanish Armada of 1588. If you haven't listened to part 1, we suggest going back and listening to it. There's a lot of important information, background information, and some insight into the main characters of the story that we'll be talking about today and going forward. We, of course, being your hosts, myself, Taylor, and Tanner. But before I bring in Tanner, let's thank a few people who deserve a thanking. Thank you to Katrina and Andrew for joining us on Patreon. We sincerely appreciate your support, and we hope that you enjoy the bonus episodes over there. With the thank yous done, we'll go ahead and move into the media check-in. Tanner, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing pretty well. It's been a good week. Got out on Friday for Arbor Day, planted some trees.
Nice. I saw the pictures.
Got to meet one of our local representatives here in the Appleton area. That was kind of cool. Nice way to spend a day with some of my students. It was theoretically better than sitting in class, but they might have different thoughts about that. Otherwise, a lot of good stuff going on. Music-wise, Dave Hawes dropped a new album, Drive It Like It's Stolen. That came out on Friday. He just consistently releases such good music. I was very happy to get a hold of that.
Nice.
And then also, book-wise, I've been reading No Land for Heroes by Cal Black. Absolutely just blazing through that one, so I have ordered the second one in that series.
Nice.
Cal is one of our listeners and followers on Twitter. It's truly amazing. Like it's a wonderful, unique mix of fantasy and Western stuff. It appeals in some ways to the same part of me that loves the movie Wild Wild West. That same sort of mix of creativity and the Old West. So lovely stuff. I'm very excited to get into the second one.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. That sounds very intriguing.
How about you? What have you been up to?
Kind of lame, I guess. Like just kind of Fortnite, actually. I've gotten back into that. I've been playing with some friends in the limited free time that I have with work being crazy. It's a really crazy time at work right now with getting into the spring season and everything. It's starting to get busy again. But Fortnite, like it's fun. It's a fun way to spend time with friends and actually interact because like you're talking the whole time and everything. So I guess it's kind of the nostalgia for being 10 years old and having your buddies over and playing some games, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same thing at the end of the day.
Speaking of getting blown to hell and making no progress over the space of a fortnight.
And getting all your buddies together. Like everyone got together with their buddies.
We are going to talk about part 2 of the Spanish Armada here today. So when we left off last week, part 1, the Armada had just received its new commander, Alonso Perez de Guzman, the Duke of Medina, Sidonia. We read his very long-winded and pretty annoyingly self-deprecating letter that he wrote to Philip, laying out all the reasons that he should not be chosen as the replacement for the late Marquis of Santa Cruz. Can we get an F in the chat for the Marquis of Santa Cruz? So regardless of his complaints, Medina Sidonia was going to be stuck in this new position, and now he's tasked with getting the Armada moving. Before we get in here, the Armada, wanted to talk about this a little bit. One of the overarching features of this, the Armada is a largely Spanish endeavor, but in addition to that, it's painted, certainly by Philip, as being a Catholic endeavor, something he is doing for the good of the faith to bring in this rogue kingdom, back into the true church. So that being the case, where's the rest of Catholic Europe in all this? Philip did have some support from the newly appointed Pope Sixtus. This makes me laugh so much, but this is Sixtus V. Although that support was solely monetary, and it was also conditional. Sixtus promised Philip 1 million ducats in support once troops had successfully landed in England. So nothing until that point.
Nothing until basically, I think you're going to be successful.
Yes. There was a lot of mutual dislike between Philip and the Pope, which led to a lot of factionalism in the church. So the Vatican's basically divided between your sort of pro-Philip parties and your pro-Pope parties.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense kind of as a weaselly / shrewd move on Sixtus's part, in that it probably doesn't look good for him to ignore this endeavor that one of his Catholic champions is undertaking.
Mm-hmm.
But he also definitely does not want Spain to add England to its crown. It behooves Sixtus for that not to happen also. So this kind of seems like a good hedging his bet of like, hey, I'll give you something. I promise I will. If you land and it looks like this is going to be successful anyway, he might as well take advantage of the PR.
We talk about things like Vietnam and America, like learning its lesson, when in reality, like this stuff's gone on forever. Like, as long as international politics has been a thing, there's been like that outside parties meddling in other countries' business. Like it truly is something that has gone on forever.
One of the things we'll talk mostly about in the bonus episode is going to be some of the more counterfactual type stuff, some of the what if discussion. And one of the things we'll talk about is sort of the sort of scaffolding they had set up to kind of put in place to govern England, both from a political and a religious standpoint. You know, if we're going to install Catholicism or reinstall Catholicism, you know, they had people selected to be, you know, this is going to be the head of the church in England when we get there, and set him up. So there's a lot of cool things that go on there. So with all of that, we know that the Armada is going to get a little bonus, or Philip's going to get a little bonus as soon as the Armada gets troops onto the soil of England.
I was just reading a little bit more about Sixtus, and it sounds like he wanted to like conquer everywhere, though. Like he wanted to destroy the Turks, conquer Egypt, all kinds of fun things.
Makes sense. I mean, you got to have lofty goals as the Pope, I guess.
Right.
And yeah, the more stuff Philip conquers, that's less for the Pope to have.
He also renewed the excommunication of Queen Elizabeth. I didn't know you had to like renew it.
Got to keep the tags current. What if Elizabeth got it to have it on that technicality? And Sixtus gets there and he's just so pissed. He's like, I thought I had her excommunicated. And God just has like a big stack of like unfinished paperwork. And he's like,
didn't get it in by the deadline.
Sorry about this. Terribly awkward. So the Armada did finally leave Lisbon on the evening of May 30th, 1588, slowly making its way out of the harbor and into the open sea. Lisbon is an interesting city, famed maritime city. If you look at a map of Lisbon, you can see why this is one of the great ports of Europe, especially at the time when keeping your fleet defended would have been a big deal. We mentioned in part one that a repeat of the Cadiz raid would be highly unlikely at Lisbon. And again, looking at the map will kind of show you why. There's actually some rough geographical similarities to the Bay Area in San Francisco, with the main city of Lisbon occupying the north side of the harbor. And compared to the relatively exposed port at Cadiz, the port of Lisbon has this pretty narrow entrance with the mouth of the Tagus River, and that opens into the Tagus estuary. So if you look at Lisbon, there's kind of a skinny opening into the harbor, and then it really expands out into a place where you could fit a pretty massive fleet. So in total, 130 ships sailed out from Lisbon as part of the Armada. A far cry from Santa Cruz's requested 510 ships.
Yeah, that's a massive difference.
And even this is the hugest fleet that anybody has ever seen. And you think about what Santa Cruz originally asked for, and you kind of see the surreality of that request. So these are broken down into a few administrative groupings. Some of these are geographical and others are by role. So Medina Sidonia's main group was designated the Portuguese squadron, with the Duke himself in the San Martin. The Biscayan squadron was under the 62-year-old veteran Juan Martinez de Recalde. I name-dropped Recalde in the first episode. He's a pretty important figure in the Armada. He's Medina Sidonia's second in command. And so there's some weird stuff that goes on with the command of this. They're broken into those squadrons, but the commanders of each of those squadrons isn't necessarily with that squadron.
Weird.
The higher ranking ones are with Medina Sidonia. Recalde was sailing on the vice flagship, the San Juan, but in the Duke's squadron. Recalde was the most experienced and also the oldest officer in the fleet. He'd sailed previously in command of the Indian Guard. Those are the warships that protected the treasure fleets sailing from the New World. He'd sailed against the Dutch, and probably most relevant to what they're doing here, he had also led a landing of Spanish troops in Ireland in 1580.
Interesting. So this wasn't like the first time they'd thought about doing this.
Yeah. I kind of mentioned some of those abortive attempts from Spain to support these kinds of things. And they had literally landed troops in Ireland in 1580. Didn't go very well. A lot of guys died. But Recalde did make it back to Spain. Next up, we have Diego Flores de Valdez. He led the Castilian squadron, while his cousin / arch enemy, Don Pedro de Valdez, led the Andalusian squadron.
Well, so we have some family squabbles.
Remember that rivalry for later. That's going to come back up in a very funny way, in my opinion. Also, in the previous episode, I called them the Flores cousins. The Valdez cousins is what they should be called. Only one of them is a Flores. I feel like we should do this in like an arena announcer voice. Next up, we have Miguel de Oquendo. He's leading the Guipuzcoan squadron. The Levant squadron is led by Martin de Bertendona. The squadron of hulks, so this is just a bunch of big, fat transport ships. They're under Juan Gomez de Medina in the flagship Gran Grifon, sailing out of Hamburg. Each of those geographically designated squadrons, that's between 600 and 800 sailors with about 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers. That gives you a hint of the breakdown of the personnel here. This is definitely heavily oriented on land-based soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
So these aren't tactical groupings or anything. They basically have no bearing on where the vessels sail or line up during an engagement.
So there's no real organization beyond get over there?
This basically functions as a head count and for provisioning at the beginning, but once they're at sea, it kind of becomes what makes the most sense for people to be.
Mm-hmm.
So in addition to these, there's a few sections of more specialized craft. So there's a squadron of 4 galleys under Diego de Medrano, and these are galleys basically like you would have seen, not too different from like the ancient world.
Mm-hmm.
They're oar powered. So you have banks of rowers. The only real difference is that they have cannons on them. These are really useful for shallow draft areas and maneuverability. So when it came to close support for, say, an amphibious landing, these would have been super useful. And then also their oar power meant they weren't dependent on the wind.
Yeah, I definitely could not have told you that triremes were basically still being used.
It's 1571, we talked about the Battle of Lepanto last week, and that's known as the last sea battle that featured primarily galleys on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
So these are kind of being phased out at this time. So there's a squadron of 4 galleasses. Yes, from Naples under Don Hugo de Moncada. That's the San Lorenzo, the Zuniga, the Girona, and the Napolitana. What is a galleass, you ask? Galleass is basically a cross between a galleon and a galley. So it takes the armament basically of a galleon, but with the oar power benefits of a galley.
Interesting.
These were some of the most dangerous ships in the fleet. These are the ships that would have really been scaring the English because they're more maneuverable. They're not as dependent on the wind, but they're also super heavily armed.
Yeah, it sounds like something that's kind of innovative for its time.
Yeah, this was kind of a way to bring the galley forward a little bit in time, kind of make it able to punch at its weight in a modern battle.
It's like when we reactivated all those the battleships and put Tomahawk missiles on them. It's kind of like that.
This is the Tomahawk missile of the time. So there's about 20 smaller vessels. They're classified as pataches and sabras. These are they're usually translated as pinnaces in English. Mm-hmm. So they're relatively small, fast, maneuverable. They're used for reconnaissance and, carrying messages, things like that. Most of the ships are Spanish or Portuguese in origin. Some did come from Italy, such as the Venetian Trinidad Valenciera. We'll talk about that in part 3, or whenever we get to the shipwrecks. Others are foreign ships that had just been impounded because they happened to have stopped in a Spanish port while this was being put together. So quite a few ships were there totally against their will.
That is funny. You don't think about stuff like that.
Yeah, as this ship belongs to us now. So after leaving Lisbon, the Armada almost immediately encountered adverse weather with heavy winds from the northwest, and they made very little progress for well over a week. And at times, they're actually being pushed backwards. They're trying to sail directly into the wind, and these ships just can't do that. One of the sources, I don't know as much about sailing, but it mentioned that the closest they could sail to the wind was a 45-degree angle.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas some of the English ships can sail basically just a few points off the wind and still make progress.
Yeah, I know that has a lot to do with the way the rigging is done and even the way the ship's built. I don't know enough about that to have too much of an opinion.
Yeah, so one of the things here, you see this in paintings, art of the Armada, you see these big towering Spanish galleons and usually these more low-profile English vessels.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Spanish ships in general did have very high profiles because they still had these fore and aft fighting castles. That was pretty integral to the style of fighting that they wanted to do. And that prevented them from tacking very close into the wind. So quoting here from Martin and Parker.
Even at this early stage of the voyage, it must have been evident to anyone who looked ahead that the English Channel would be a one-way ride. The fleet could not sail up it except with a westerly wind, and unless the wind changed, it could not sail out again, nor could it stop and anchor. If it did, it would not be able to defend itself.
While both fleets, obviously, they're sailing ships for the most part, they're both dependent on the wind to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
The Spanish are far more tightly bound to what the wind tells them they have to do.
Yeah, it's interesting that they literally can't do some of the things that they're asked to do.
That line struck me as particularly ominous in that, any of the sailors, especially on board, they probably realize what they're getting into, that they can't just turn around if something goes wrong.
Yeah, I would think them more than anyone are probably super aware of what they're facing.
As we'll see in the next parts, that is a long trip up around Scotland and Ireland to get back to Spain. That last part highlights one of the major flaws in the final Armada plan. This plan that had been drawn up basically by Philip. Philip had planned for a rendezvous at sea, with Parma's army leaving Dunkirk just as the Armada arrived to escort them. But there's no way to make sure that timing is going to come off perfectly.
Right.
Because Parma can't just load his men and keep them on the ships. That's not going to work. If he waits until he can see the Armada, approaching Dunkirk, then there's going to be this delay and the Armada's sitting out in the channel. A similar problem to what we talked about with the Lusitania.
Mm-hmm.
With those vessels, they had to time their arrivals absolutely perfectly to make it in, in that case, it was into Liverpool, because if they had to circle around, that was party time for the U-boats.
Yeah, it is interesting that it's some of the same issues. And I was thinking about, it's funny that location-wise for both of our big series that we've done now, it's basically all going to take place in the same area.
So yeah, likewise, if the Armada has to stop off of Dunkirk, that's kind of worst case scenario for them because there's not much they can do.
I was just going to say it's interesting seeing this is put together with basically just-in-time logistics and, kind of the way we do things now. And, we're able to do that to some degree now because of GPS and barcodes and, things like that. But this would have been impossible at the time to be this coordinated.
You could really only do this if you had modern technology to communicate in real time.
It's hard enough as is, with real communication.
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting. This is a very bold and logistically complex plan.
And that's far from the only problem with the meetup. There's another problem we'll get to in the next episode that makes the timing only one cog in the problem machine. Complicating things further in this whole process was the hierarchy on board these Spanish ships. So quoting here from David Howarth's The Voyage of the Armada.
Their sailors were skillful, but their aristocrats and their national heroes were soldiers. So their concept of sea fighting was soldierly. In a Spanish galleon, the soldiers regarded themselves as the most important people. They were commanded by their own land officers, not by the captain of the ship, and they looked on the sailors somewhat as their servants. Men not far removed from galley slaves, whose only job was to carry them to the scene of the battle and put them in an advantageous position to win it.
That reminded me a little bit of the bonus Lusitania episode where we talked about social outgroups and sort of how, depending on the shifting situation, they'll bind together to pick on another group. I feel like maybe this is what some of these Spanish soldiers felt. Because, if you're a regular foot soldier in the Spanish army, you're not coming from any sort of decent background, probably. You're probably used to getting looked down on and spit on by your social betters. And so now that you finally have an excuse that, hey, there's someone finally lower on the pole than I am, these poor sailors.
When you're in that position, it's always nice to have another of some sort that you can kind of, well, at least I'm not them.
Contrast that we just heard about the how things worked on a Spanish vessel. Contrast that to the attitude on board the English ships, which is summarized here by Sir Francis Drake himself. I must have the gentleman to haul and draw with the mariner, and the mariner with the gentleman. Let us show ourselves to be of a company. I would know him that would refuse to set his hand to a rope, but I know there is not any such here. I always read that quote with an air of menace almost, where it sounds like maybe there were at some point, but he has taken care of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously not fully equal on these ships, but if something comes up, if there's a situation where they need to, haul in a line or something, the captain, Frobisher, Drake, one of those guys is going to jump in and do that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas that is inconceivable on the Spanish side, that, you'd have your officers doing this.
Yeah, I feel like there's a little bit more of, I know it's kind of like the stereotypical thing from like the Marines or whatever of like, we don't see race, like, we hate everybody equally. It's a little bit of that on the English ships of it's going to suck for everyone. Like just,
or like what we talked about with submarines
mm-hmm.
a few times, where there is that little bit more egalitarian setup,
mm-hmm.
just because of the nature of the service. Like you said, it kind of sucks for everyone. So everyone is kind of participating in this equally.
Yeah, I think that is interesting that it's just set up that way, which I would imagine probably actually empowers people a little bit more to care about their job.
Yeah, and again, like this is no utopia on the English ships. Those responsibilities are more evenly distributed. Pay is still very much dictated by birth rather than skill. Even Drake, so he was not highborn. He only earned 30 shillings a month, and that doesn't mean much to modern listeners, I guess. Compare that to the common sailors' 10 shillings a month.
Huh. Yeah, that's really not that much more.
The most famous name in the Navy is only making 3 times what a common sailor makes. While Lord Howard, I think he was making something like £3 plus a month. So yeah, I mean, there's that stratification. The lords, the nobility are definitely making more just because of who they are. And even someone like Drake is not making significantly more. Granted, he is hauling in a lot because of the things that he's captured, so he's getting all that prize money. This is kind of funny regarding the regular sailor's wage is described here by Hanson as
4 pence a day, at a time when 1.5 to 2 pence per day was judged the minimum necessary to keep Spanish prisoners of war from starving to death. You're like twice as much as a prisoner.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Chris Rock quote about minimum wage, where he's like, if I could pay you less, I would, but it's against the law.
I have always thought about that. Anytime I see like a minimum wage posted jobs, it's like, yeah, you really do just want to pay me less.
And it also reminds me, when we talked about the prison hulks and how really the food and the treatment of the prisoners was not super terrible compared to what it could have been, and how like the rations the British soldiers are getting is not that much better.
I mean, I think that's almost sort of something along the lines of like we're talking about like the submarine conditions. I doubt that the officers they're maybe eating better at first, but like when they're out sailing, like everyone's eating the same bad food.
With the painfully slow progress of the Armada, the decision was made to put into port at Corunna on the northwest coast of Spain to load up on provisions and make any necessary repairs. Corunna is the same place as La Coruña, which will probably go back and forth between both names. We talked about La Coruña in episode 22 with the Casson. That's that same area, Galicia, around Cape Finisterre. This is all that area, the northwest corner of Spain. So the Armada put into Corunna on June 19th. Or to be more accurate, it began putting into port. A fleet that big, it's going to take a while.
Yeah, that's a process.
About 50 ships were left outside as the sun went down. So they kind of paused that overnight. Among those 50 ships were most of the transport hulks, the squadron under Juan Martinez de Recalde, and the 4 galleasses. Now, given that this endeavor was sanctioned by God himself and organized by his earthly representative Philip II of Spain, would you like to guess what happened next?
Did the winds calm down and everything get better?
Not exactly. There's an enormous southwesterly gale that blows up with these 50 ships still outside the safety of the harbor.
That's not good.
This is such a strong storm that even ships that are in the harbor are getting tossed around and damaged, getting thrown into each other.
That feels less than ideal. I don't think that's the way I would draw that part up of the plan.
The quote here, and I believe this is from Medina, Sidonia, describing it as, "So violent a sea and wind, accompanied by fog and tempest, have never been seen." So this storm raged for about 2 days until the 21st.
Wow.
At which point Medina, Sidonia sent out pinnaces to find his missing ships. Basically, all the ships that were outside got scattered.
Right.
So news came in from ports along the north coast of Spain of, little handfuls of ships here and there. They'd, sought shelter in a harbor or a little bay, whatever.
I feel like for most things that we read, like this would be enough to call everything off. But I'm assuming since we still have multiple episodes left to go, that this is not enough for them to be like, let's regroup.
Well, you're thinking kind of similarly to Medina, Sidonia here, but we'll get to that in a minute. So on June 22nd, so the next day, Juan Recalde was able to lead 10 ships back into Corunna. Alonso de Leyva, he led 10 ships into the port at Vivero, which is about 45 miles northeast of Corunna. But by the 24th, so 3 days later, about 30 ships are still missing. A lot of ships needed repairs, and of course, the men on board are starting to get sick. So scurvy, dysentery, the whole smorgasbord of ship-based diseases, they're all starting to come in here. As bad as all of that was, losing ships, starting to lose men, something possibly worse happens next. Medina Sidonia has to sit down and write a letter to inform Philip of what's happening.
The storm would be extraordinary at the end of June, but being as it is on so great an occasion in the service of our Lord, it is even more extraordinary, considering how fervently the enterprise has been commended and devoted to him. We must therefore conclude that what has happened has been for some good and just reason. He's like knows that he's got to spin it that way to him of like, hey, everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, there's some great justification in a lot of these exchanges between Medina Sidonia and Philip. It reminds me a bit of the Seinfeld, like, not that there's anything wrong with that, where he's complaining, he's saying, oh, this terrible thing happened. I mean, this probably isn't going to work, but like, I mean, of course it was for a good reason, obviously, because it was ordained by God. But so despite Medina Sidonia's attempt at just playing along with the plan, at the end of the letter, he does kind of surprisingly have the audacity to suggest that Philip consider postponing the invasion until the following year, and maybe seeking a settlement with England through some other means. And you can imagine that letter being opened and read by Philip. Philip responds to Medina Sidonia. He sits down on July 1st and writes this.
From what I know of you, I believe that your bringing all these matters to my attention arises solely from your zeal to serve me and a desire to succeed in your command. The certainty that this is so prompts me to be franker with you than I should be with another. If this were an unjust war, the storm might be taken as a sign of God's will that we should cease from our offense. As, however, it is so just, it is not to be believed that God will withhold his aid. He will rather favor that cause, even to the utmost of our desires. Every great enterprise is beset with difficulties, and the merit lies in overcoming them. I have dedicated this enterprise to God. Stir yourself, then, to do your duty.
Just imagining Medina Sidonia opening that letter, the part where he says, this so prompts me to be franker with you than I would be with another. So like, not going to like the next part. So the last missing ship finally limped back into Corunna on July 15th. And an additional few days passed before the Armada was ready to sail again. On the morning of the 21st, they did just that. So by dawn of the next day, Spain was out of sight behind them. For quite a lot of the people aboard, it would not be seen again. This is kind of impressive, this first major setback. And they end up getting all their ships back.
Yeah, that is pretty impressive.
So, maybe Philip was right about this. Nothing bad can go wrong because this is blessed by God.
He's not seeing any challenges, just opportunities.
This is the mindset you need to have.
It's really like the original grind set.
I think it's easier to be a grind set guy when you have all of the riches of the New World spilling out of your pockets. So word had made its way to England that the Spanish fleet was readying to sail once again. So this whole time, there's spy networks and informants and things like that. So people know what each other are doing. And so in England, they knew that the Armada had run into a storm, put into port. A lot of the English captains see this as a massive opportunity. Thinking back on the Cadiz raid, they're probably thinking like, guys, we have a chance to do like the funniest thing in history. So let's talk about a few more of the guys from the English side. All guys, unfortunately. This is another episode that does not pass the Bechdel test. So we discussed Francis Drake, the most famous of the English sea captains. Drake served as vice admiral during the Armada campaign. So he was subordinate to Lord High Admiral Howard.
I feel like I don't know him as much.
The Howard family was pretty important. One of Henry VIII's wives, Catherine Howard, had been a Howard. Okay. And so they're kind of just a big family in English politics. And that's why he's Lord High Admiral. It's not because he has so much experience.
Right.
And in fact, he has relatively little experience at sea. But like Medina Sidonia, he's also pretty open to hearing what his subordinates tell him.
He's like an organizer.
He knows he has some of like the greatest sea captains probably ever that will exist, and he listens to them. So other names to note are John Hawkins and Martin Frobisher. Hawkins was actually Drake's cousin, and he had been the one to sort of get Drake into ships, into that lifestyle. John Hawkins also very famous as an instrumental figure in the early Atlantic slave trade.
Boo.
Yeah, in which Drake also participated early in his career.
I kind of assumed that like all of these people at least had some role in some part of it.
Yeah, if you only look at John Hawkins in the Armada campaign, it's like, oh, he's such a hero, but like, don't read the early parts of his Wikipedia page. Martin Frobisher, he's someone that we have some listeners who are into Arctic exploration. Frobisher might be a name that we're already familiar with. Slightly cooler than the slave trade, I would say. Early Arctic exploration in what is now Canada. So he was up around Baffin Island, places like that. Still tied to European colonialism, but not literally selling human beings for profit.
Yeah.
C- for Frobisher. So Lord Howard had originally planned to keep all the English naval assets near the coast.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. You don't want the Armada to get past you, certainly.
Right.
Drake and his colleagues, they really pushed the idea of a preemptive attack on the Armada while it was still in Corunna.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we said it was basically untouchable in Lisbon, but Corunna is different. It's going to be a little bit more assailable there, especially if they're still recovering from all this damage. Howard, like I said, didn't have the experience of the subordinates, but to his credit, he was very willing to take advice.
I confess my error at that time, but I did and will yield ever unto them of greater experience. The opinion of Sir Francis Drake, Mr. Hawkins, Mr. Frobisher, and others that be men of greatest judgment and experience, as also my own, is that the surest way to meet the Spanish fleet is upon their own coast, or in any harbor of their own, and there to defeat them.
I think Howard probably gets the medal for humblest noble I've ever heard.
Yeah, it seems like he is. I mean, maybe he's just one of those smart people who understands that they don't know as much as maybe other people. And he's like, hey, I can let everyone, like, maybe he's just a good idea guy. Like, you get, you know what I mean? Like, you kind of listen to some ideas and you're like, this one.
I think to an extent, it seems like he knows what he's there for. He's there because they have to have a noble person in this Lord Admiral position. And he knows what he's not there for.
Right.
So it seems like he manages this well. So Thomas Fenner, another captain, he wrote to Elizabeth's secretary, Francis Walsingham, with similar sentiments.
We rest here a great number of valiant men, and to great charge upon my gracious mistress, and a great grief of mine to spend her majesty's treasure, and do nothing upon the enemy. So
argument here is, you're paying for all these ships, you're paying to feed all these guys, and we're sitting here doing nothing. We could be getting this job done and then not worry about it. So Howard wasn't immediately given the go-ahead for this. He kind of gets increasingly desperate because his subordinates are getting increasingly agitated. So he finally gets permission from Elizabeth on July 2nd. And by the morning of the 4th, about 100 ships left Plymouth bound for Corunna and the anchored Armada. So they fought against some adverse winds, and they made very little progress until the 17th, when the wind shifted back to a northerly direction. So with this favorable wind, the English fleet made it to about 60 miles away from Corunna when that wind died down and then turned back to come from the southwest.
Mm-hmm.
If that doesn't happen, like, we have a very different Armada story to tell,
right?
Probably. So once that happened, now they're sailing into this wind after being becalmed. Even Drake, who's one of the more aggressive proponents of this plan, even he realizes that now they're really in danger.
Right.
This wind they're sailing into is perfect for the Armada to sail out of Corunna. That and the lack of provisions forced the English to turn for home, and they were back in Plymouth by July 22nd.
It's just amazing how slow this unfolds.
Yeah, this happens over the span of weeks and months here.
There's almost like a Cuban Missile Crisis vibe to kind of how this goes.
And so, yes, in fact, that wind that they suspected would be perfect for the Armada was. They used that exact same wind to finally leave Corunna. The Armada struggled its way across the Bay of Biscay, and it's at this point the thing that we've all been waiting for. Some shipwreck action.
All right.
It begins to take its first losses in the form of all 4 of the galleys.
I don't suppose those are really built for this area, were they?
Yeah, they're built for operation in the Mediterranean, which can get rough in the Mediterranean, but not like an Atlantic storm.
Mm-hmm.
So those oar-powered galleys, they were really low in the water, and they were very narrow. They were built for those calmer conditions. The Diana was the first ship to leave the formation. She was taking so much water that she had to turn for the French coast, and she ran aground at Bayonne.
So she didn't make it far at all.
And credit to the captains of these galleys, though, they don't make it very far, but they also very quickly diagnose that they won't if they keep going. The other 3 galleys followed shortly after that, also running for the coast.
After nightfall, when the weather became thick with very heavy rain, they were lost sight of, and we have seen them no more. Medina, Sidonia.
So those galleys, they were, of course, a loss, but they also had a pretty specialized role.
Mm-hmm.
They were landing support. It would have been nice to have them, but it wasn't going to make or break the Armada, probably. Soon another ship is lost. That's maybe a little bit more of a hit. This is the flagship of the Biscayan squadron, the Santa Ana. So that's a ship that was already in kind of rough shape from the Corunna storm. And her captain sought shelter in the Bay of La Hogue, and he did not attempt to rejoin the fleet.
I feel like losing your flagship is bad.
One of the flagships.
Yeah, don't do that.
The Santa Ana was a concerning loss with her 30 guns and 300 men. That's a fair chunk of men there. 300 men, nothing to sneeze at.
Mm-hmm.
So a good portion of the sea conditions, as they're crossing the bay, they come directly from Medina Sidonia, who was, by his own admission, a landlubber.
Not only did the waves mount to the skies, but some seas broke clean over the ships. It was the most cruel night ever seen.
Neil Hanson, in The Confident Hope of a Miracle, he notes that, quote, Medina Sidonia complained with the hyperbole of a landsman experiencing his first major storm at sea. John Hawkins sailed through the same storm and described it as, quote, a little flaw.
That is funny.
I think this would be a good time to remind the Duke that this is every day up in Alaska.
That's right.
But this is interesting because it shows you how perspective is everything. For someone like Hawkins, who's been on the seas for most of his life, since he was 7 or 8 years old, to him, this is just kind of another day. It's barely worth a mention. And you've got Medina Sidonia saying, this is apocalyptic. This is the worst thing that humans have ever seen.
Yeah, that is funny to see that.
I would have been on the Medina Sidonia side of that, I'm sure. So at dawn the next day, so this is the 28th, 40 Spanish ships are reported to be missing. The bulk of these had gotten out ahead of the main body, and they would be able to rejoin the Armada. And to me, this is just another point in favor of sort of reframing the Armada for what it was and what it was actually ever capable of doing. This is the second time that a major portion of the fleet has been scattered. And again, it's able to recoalesce, reform, and keep going. This is a hugely impressive thing that they're doing here.
Yeah, like it's great for like the logistics capabilities of the time. But like this plan requires something that was 300 years away.
It underscores a running theme in the histories of the Armada from the Spanish side. This plan and the necessity of doing it this exact way, that all goes back to Philip. So he had drawn up basically an impossible plan, and the Armada executed their portion almost flawlessly. They handled some really big problems, and they come back together. They keep their cohesion when twice now other fleets could have given up within reason. And yeah, we'll see in part 3 how the wheels fall off during the rendezvous portion, but up until then, they're doing a pretty stellar job. So the Armada was first sighted off the English coast on July 29th. This was at the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall. That set off a series of beacon fires alerting the English that their wait was over. So the English fleet, they had attempted that strike on Corunna. They'd been forced back to Plymouth. So that's where they were anchored, awaiting the arrival of the Armada. So with the wind on their side, for the moment, there's discussion among the Spanish commanders about entering Plymouth Harbor while the English are unable to escape. The English are stuck in there as long as the wind and tides are as they are. And that would play extremely well into the Spanish naval combat doctrine of closing with the enemy, grappling, and boarding.
Mm-hmm.
This is the reason for the Spanish emphasis on soldiers rather than sailors. As we discussed way, way back in the Mary Rose episode, the strategy here for Spain, about 40 years later, is still to essentially fight a land battle on the sea.
Yeah, I feel like that just becomes more obsolete by the year at this point, with more of firearms and things like that coming onto the scene.
And this story we're telling here is one of the big clashes between those two styles. So Neil Hanson includes a very vivid description of the ideal Spanish sea battle.
As the oar-powered galleys and galleasses closed on their prey, a single close-range fusillade would be fired from their guns, which shattered on impact to send a blizzard of rock fragments scything through the enemy troops. Smaller, murdering pieces firing hail, scissor, and dice shot cubes of iron encased in lead, which caused horrific damage to human flesh.
Great ships carried out the same form of attack, using their heavier armaments to smash the upper works of the enemy and disable its anti-personnel weapons. Musketeers and arquebusiers caused further carnage by unleashing a hail of small arms fire from the towering fore and stern castles, and the enemy troops in the fighting tops were particularly targeted.
Men then poured aboard, clambering over the rails and swarming through open gun ports. Vicious hand-to-hand fighting with pike, sword, and axe would continue until the ship was captured or the attackers slaughtered.
So yeah, I like the description there of what the Spanish are trying to do in basically all circumstances here, and how awful that sounds.
Yeah, it doesn't sound great.
We'll see this a little bit more in the combat portions of it, but the Spanish basically want to use their naval guns not too different than how they would use guns in a land battle. You're using them to soften up the other guys and then send in the foot soldiers. Whereas on the English side, those are their primary weapons. They have no intention of getting close enough to be grappled or boarded.
Right.
So that was discussed because, hey, this is like perfect. The enemy fleet is trapped in port. We have the wind behind us. This is like a tailor-made situation for the Spanish Navy to fight. However, Philip had expressly ordered the Armada not to deviate from their rendezvous with Parma. Rule number 1, first rule of Fight Club, do not deviate from the rendezvous. So this wasn't the time for the Spanish to join into a close quarters battle.
I imagine there's a lot of what if there, but like, I guess there is something to be said for sticking to the plan. It's like, you don't know that just because the conditions are favorable, like what else does that cause?
And one of the things is the English would not have been super prepared to fight, but the Spanish don't know that.
Right.
They don't know that the English had just sailed out and had to run back. Philip's rules told them they were not to land or seize any port in England, nor even seek an engagement with the English fleet unless it was forced upon them. They're not supposed to be interested in having a sea battle. That's not what they're there for. And this is one of the big what-ifs of, if the Marquis of Santa Cruz was still alive to command this? Does something different happen here? Because there's a chance that he gambles on landing that punch and sailing into Plymouth because he had the experience. He had decades of doing things like this. He would have known an opportunity when he saw it and quite possibly would have done that.
It's like there's a real like Ulysses S. Grant versus McClellan like thing going on here.
And he may have also felt more confident in defying Philip because he had won all these great victories for Philip. He probably felt he had a little bit more of a leash.
That's true.
Confidence or recklessness to disregard those orders, assuming that, if he's successful and he takes out Drake and Howard and the whole English fleet, there's no way Philip's going to be angry at him.
Right.
So ultimately, the decision was made to continue on past Plymouth and head east further into the Channel. Like you were saying, it being a good move, taking into account his orders and the fact that these are unknown waters, it's hard to fault Medina Sidonia here. Caution seems like the better move. When you're not an experienced naval commander, you don't know these coastal waters you're sailing into. You have no idea what is waiting for you there. So it's around this time we get the famous story of Sir Francis Drake and his game of bowls. So the story goes that Drake was in the middle of his game of bowls is lawn bowling, so sort of like bocce ball, when he heard that the Spanish had been sighted. Drake, with all his dashing confidence, he says, quote, "Time enough to play the game and thrash the Spaniards afterwards."
Oh, those are fun stories.
He just continues playing. That story is not documented until decades after the Armada.
Yeah, that definitely sounds too good to be true.
Like we say with stories and folklore, though, often the importance isn't whether or not it happened that way, but what truth it's supposed to represent.
Right.
In this case, Drake's cavalier attitude, it really does represent the facts on the ground, in that the English fleet was basically stuck until the tides changed. So they really had to wait for the ebb tide for any English ships to exit the harbor. Drake would have known that. Drake was as familiar with the waters around Plymouth as probably anybody in the world. It's not too far-fetched to think he would have had a reaction similar to this. Whether or not that's what he was doing and what he said, that would have been the response is, hey,
right.
Okay, we need to be getting ready sometime in the next few hours, but there's no reason to, get ahead of ourselves. So on the night of the 30th and into the 31st, the English fleet maneuvered into position to engage the Armada.
The Lord Admiral skillfully led most of his ships across the front of the Armada to gain the weather gauge on the right, while Drake's squadron, by tacking close inshore, reached a corresponding position on the left.
The Armada reorganized into a fighting formation with Don Alonso Martinez de Leyva on the left wing with 20 capital ships, Recalde with another 20 on the right, and Medina Sidonia leading the remaining ships in the center. So all in all, this Spanish formation is about 2 miles wide. An English observer of this commented,
"We never thought that they could ever have found, gathered and joined such a great force of puissant ships together and so well appointed them with cannon, culverin, and other pieces of brass ordnance."
Martin and Parker also point out that maintaining such a large formation is no small feat of seamanship.
Whatever its failings, and as yet, Howard and his officers knew few of them, it was clear that the Armada would be no soft touch.
One of the general things, kind of broad brush things you hear about the Armada is that you have good sailors on the English side and bad sailors on the Spanish side. And while the technology may make it seem that way, instances like this show that the Spanish sailors knew what they were doing. They were quite proficient at holding these formations and shifting around as needed. So it's at this point we see the first exchange of fire between the two fleets. So another cool little movie moment here. To get things started, Lord Howarth decided on sending a message in the form of the 80-ton pinnace Disdain. There's a sweet name for the ship to do this. Disdain sailed out from the main body of the English into, not into the middle, but into, it's kind of like a crescent almost that it's sailing into that and firing one shot from its bow chaser and then just turning and hauling ass back for the English fleet. Some of the Spanish ships on the right wing, they got some shots away at the Disdain, but they all fell really far short. This is, exactly what it seems like. This is throwing down the gauntlet. This is the exchange of insults to get things going here. Some of the sources point out that there was no official war declared between England and Spain. So Howard may have felt that he was ceremonially starting the war by firing this single shot. Some additional exchanges over the next 2 hours. Neither side really takes any damage worth noting, just because of the distance that's kept up by the English. In the words of Lord Howard,
"We durst not adventure to put in amongst them, their fleet being so strong."
The English fleet, they weren't able to read 5 books about the Spanish Armada to see what the plans were, but the commanders had surmised that the Armada was making probably for the Low Countries to join with Parma. They hadn't made landfall. They hadn't made directly for the coast. The only other logical place for them to be going, if they're heading into the channel, is a rendezvous with Parma. So that influenced the English strategy of harrying the Armada all the way through the channel. And so that's why the Armada campaign, I think, to me is so interesting, because it isn't a battle per se. There's not this one big clash. This is the Armada running down the channel and the English most of the time chasing them. Significant portions of the Armada campaign, the English fleet is wholly or partially behind the Spanish. So rather than, facing off, they're behind them, chipping away at the edges, waiting for a ship to fall out of formation to be captured.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing the British be like the aggressor in these places, because most of the stories we hear, I feel like, are like World War II and World War I with like the wolf packs and stuff. So it's interesting seeing the British kind of be at the peak of their power and being like the bullies on the block,
trying to, chew away at the edges of this formation and hopefully capture some of these ships. And the emphasis definitely was on capture rather than sinking. Every enemy vessel was, a potential ship to add to their own forces. It was all of the supplies, the guns, the ammunition that was on board. It was any high value prisoners or intelligence they might be able to gain. It was prize money to be divided up amongst those responsible. So all of these things that this ship represents, you don't want to sink these enemy ships. That's a primary motivator for a lot of the people on board. And if you lose that, that's a massive hit to your morale.
Sure, yeah.
Putting your life at risk in the hopes that you're going to get some plunder or prize money out of this. And if it sinks, you've just wasted a few hours. I like to think of the English here almost as like a pack of lions or something, hunting antelope. That they don't want to charge into the middle of them, but they will wait and see if they can isolate one.
Right. Like, yeah, the person that makes a mistake or has a mechanical type issue or something like that.
So despite the lack of results from the gunfire on either side, the Armada did suffer its first 2 combat casualties. The gunfire here, they're at such a distance that, there's people have recorded here that a ball might hit a ship square on the side and just bounce off, because it's just such a distance here, way out of the effective range of these cannons. One of those casualties was the San Salvador from the Guipuzcoan Squadron. This is a ship of 25 guns, so this is one of the heavier armed ships in the Armada. At one point during the action, San Salvador just erupts into this massive explosion. It tears off 2 of her decks and her stern castle, along with all of her steering gear. So the whole back of the ship just explodes. An estimated 200 Spanish were killed either in the explosion or from jumping overboard.
So she lit some of her own powder up or something?
That's most likely. There's no solid explanation. There's a story about a disgruntled gunner lighting this on purpose to try and kill the captain, which is certainly a dramatic story.
It's a way to do it.
Martin and Parker, they point out that a simple accident with all these lit fuses and gunpowder is a far more likely explanation. On the English ships, there was pretty good gunpowder and ammunition discipline. They had a whole system of how things were to be transported, where things were to be stored. The Spanish, they don't have the same rigorous system of ship-based etiquette. It's very easy to imagine something like that going wrong. Someone who doesn't know what they're doing, dropping a fuse somewhere they shouldn't drop it. Fortunately for everyone in the general vicinity, the fire was put out before it reached her main magazine, because that had about 7 tons of gunpowder.
Yeah, there'd just been nothing left.
Yeah, that would have taken out her and probably some close by ships as well. The ship was still afloat, so she'd taken pretty enormous damage, but not below the waterline. Medina Sidonia decided to abandon her and transfer the remaining personnel to other ships. Except for the 50 or so really badly wounded who were just left on board.
Oh no, they just left them?
Yeah. until it was boarded by Sir John Hawkins later in the day, who discovered...
Did he help them?
Who discovered, along with his men, that, quote, the stink in the ship was so unsavory and the sight within board so ugly, they don't even leave a prize crew aboard the ship. They lash her to their ships and they tow her back into port. But they can't even put crew on the ship. It's so bad. Think about that. How bad was this for English sailors in the late 1500s to say, like, I can't even be here right now.
Mm-hmm.
I literally cannot even.
Yeah.
There's a lot of detail in some of the books about just the conditions on board Spanish ships. You know, the English ships weren't great, but they had much more experience with these spending time really truly living on board their ships, and so they knew a lot better about how to do that. The Spanish ships were reportedly just absolutely repulsive inside.
I'm picturing like German U-boat World War I kind of.
That's probably not a terrible comparison here. So the second casualty from this engagement is arguably more of a blow to Spain. And also, it's a little bit funnier, too, in my opinion. So in addition to the three main divisions of the Armada, there's a few ships who are kind of just free-ranging, kind of troubleshooting vessels. Mm-hmm. So whenever a ship's in trouble, they're at risk of being surrounded or captured. These ships can kind of zip in and hopefully...
It's like a quick response force type
thing, kind of fight off enough to get this ship extricated. Or like a roving safety, like the Troy Polamalu of the Spanish Armada. One of these was the Nuestra Senora del Rosario, under the command of Don Pedro de Valdez. Mm-hmm. This is one of the cousins.
I forgot about the cousins.
She had arrived to help out Recalde on the right wing as he was being surrounded by English ships. Recalde's ship is being really chewed up here. Or it's taking a lot of fire. It's not taking massive damage, but it's under a lot of fire. Mm-hmm. So what follows is a little bit of a comedy of errors, or a tragedy of errors if you're one of the poor souls who didn't make it out of this. In the process of lending assistance to Recalde, the Rosario ran into another vessel and damaged her bowsprit. The bowsprit, the thing that sticks off the front of a sailing ship. Mm-hmm. So this affected her steering and caused her to ram into the Santa Catalina. This more serious collision, this brought down Rosario's foresail and caused damage to her rigging. As the seas were getting heavier, Rosario's foremast broke and smashed into her mainmast. So now the ship is totally uncontrollable and just totally crippled. No panic yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As we saw with San Salvador, there's ways around this. So Don Pedro, he sent a messenger to Medina Sidonia, letting him know that, like, hey, we really need some help. We need a tow. We need to transfer to another ship, something. We're not going anywhere. Simple enough response. Medina Sidonia was perfectly willing to do this for the Rosario. He was making preparations to do so. But do you remember at the beginning when I said that Don Pedro and his cousin Diego were arch enemies?
Uh-huh.
This is my favorite part of the story. At the express urging of Don Pedro's cousin Diego, the Armada left the stricken Rosario behind due to concerns about the safety of the fleet. Diego, who's traveling on the ship with Medina Sidonia, so he's there as he's making this decision. He hops in, he says, no, we can't do that. That guy sucks.
This absolutely does sound like a Lions Led by Donkeys episode.
Yeah, like it's a sound enough decision. You look at the big picture, you can see his argument of we can't slow down, we can't stop for this one ship because that's going to put the rest of us at risk. But you have to imagine his absolute delight at being able to suggest this.
Right, because like a lot of times it would be like, no, that's my cousin. We need to go save them.
Yeah, you'd think he'd make an irrational decision to go save, your cousin, your whatever, your sibling. There was a Dominican friar with the fleet, Bernardo de Góngora, and he writes,
in view of this, the Duke continued on his way and left the good Don Pedro and his company in the power of the enemy, who were never more than a league behind us. God knows what happened to them.
Yeah, this is just a wonderful moment. You know that guy. We're not going to risk the entire Armada for a guy who sucks. That guy. I hate that guy. Medina Sidonia did attempt to leave some ships behind to tow the Rosario, but that ultimately was not feasible. So with the Armada leaving him behind, Don Pedro had no real choice but to just kind of wait things out. She'd lost her steering, but she'd taken no other damage. She hadn't taken any gunfire. All of her damage had come from ramming into other Spanish vessels. She was still fully armed, fully manned, should she be interested in a fight. This is very much like I don't know what to compare it to, but something like a wounded elephant, where maybe it can't move, but you don't want to get close to it. It can probably still thrash around and hurt some people. So seeing the Rosario's sails furled and with no visible lights, an English privateer vessel called the Margaret and John decided to take a closer look.
Seeing not one man show himself, nor any light appearing in her, we discharged 25 or 30 muskets into her cage work, at one volley, with arrows and bullet. They gave us 2 great shot, whereupon we let fly our broadside through her, doing some hurt.
That's an interesting quote because it reveals where the technology is at here. Yes, you've got guns. Yes, you've got muskets, but you've still got people on the English side being outfitted with bows and arrows.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
And that's the case we'll see also when we talk about some of the land forces from England. You have a lot of the people being mustered from these local militias coming out wielding, longbows that their grandparents probably used.
That is crazy to think about.
So the Margaret and John, not wanting to poke this particular wounded animal further, they pull back to the English fleet where it's nice and safe and cozy. And this is kind of an image, the accounts do it better justice, but the Margaret and John is pretty small. And this is a pretty sizable galleon she's sailing up to. So the height difference would have been enormous. The English sailors write about, we couldn't have boarded the ship if we wanted to. So we didn't really have a choice but to just kind of shoot at her a little bit. So Drake himself eventually seized the Rosario after convincing Don Pedro to surrender in the interest of saving his men.
The value of the Rosario was not only the 55,000 gold ducats it carried as wages for the invasion force and its treasure, including boxes of Toledo swords with jeweled hilts that Philip had sent as presents for the English Catholic lords, nor even its 46 cannon and great store of powder and shot. Its capture also gave Drake and the other English commanders the opportunity to discover the nature and limitations of its armaments, particularly the difficulties in reloading them when in combat or heavy seas.
So this is going to be a good point for us to wrap up today. Nice little cliffhanger here, maybe. And this is some important new intelligence that the English gain from capturing this vessel. They get on board, they look at the guns because they're interested in seeing what they're kind of up against. And at this point, the English ships carry specially designed naval guns with like a naval gun carriage and like the special truck style wheels. The advantage of those is those can be hauled back into the ship and reloaded very easily. They don't take up that much space on the inside. Roll them in, reload them, roll them back out. The Spanish vessels carry guns with just standard gun carriages that have just been rolled onto a ship, most of which are too unwieldy to be reloaded in combat. So if you think back to the description of Spanish naval tactics, that single round of cannon fire followed by boarding, you can see why this might be just fine for their needs.
Right.
In their ideal battle, it would have been totally unnecessary to reload these in combat. You're only going to use them once. Once they're fired, grappling would have commenced, and those gunners would have had other jobs to do, namely boarding or repelling boarders.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
The English, on the other hand, they had devoted gunners on their ships. If you were on the ship, you were a gunner, that was your job. So even when you closed with the enemy, you were still manning the guns. And so these guys had practiced, they knew what they were doing. They had better technology to work with. They knew a lot more about handling ammunition. So everything about this is advantage to England in terms of gunnery. So that'll come to play an enormous role in the engagements that come in part 3. So thank you for listening to part 2 of our lengthy Armada series. Next week, we're going to get into the decisive engagement between the English and the Spanish fleets. And we'll watch the Armada sail into waters that will cause them far more problems than the English guns have to this point. I think we'll sign off and just say we will talk to you again next week.